Summer had arrived in full swing, and with it came the kind of days that begged for lounging under the sun with a glass of iced tea in hand. For most families in suburban neighborhoods, summer meant barbecues, block parties, and kids racing their bikes down the quiet streets. For the homeowners of Willow Creek Estates, however, it meant competition. Competition over lawns, over cars, over patio furniture, and, most importantly, over pools. The Johnson family had only recently completed their dream backyard renovation. It had taken years of savings, late-night planning sessions, and a careful selection of contractors to get everything just right. The centerpiece was, of course, the pool. Not just any pool. This was a pristine, resort-style retreat. Crystal blue water shimmered under the sunlight, reflecting ripples like polished glass. The pool was framed with natural stone decking. A waterfall feature trickled down one side, and custom lighting made the water glow at night like liquid sapphire. For a family who valued their privacy, it was more than just a luxury. It was a sanctuary. The Johnsons weren't showy people. They didn't brag about their upgrades or try to one-up their neighbors. But in a place like Willow Creek, appearances carried weight. The sight of contractors and landscapers coming and going for months had stirred curiosity in the neighborhood. When the construction finally ended, the whispers started. It wasn't just a pool, it was the pool. The one that made every other backyard look outdated in comparison. For most, it was just a matter of admiration, or maybe envy. But for one neighbor, it became an obsession. She lived 2 houses down. Her name was Karen Wellington, a woman whose reputation stretched across every cul-de-sac and corner of Willow Creek. She was known for sticking her nose into other people's business, policing trash bins left out a little, too long, and sending lengthy emails about minor HOA violations. But behind her performative concern for neighborhood standards was something more personal: jealousy. Karen's own backyard featured a small above-ground pool, one she had purchased years earlier. She often boasted about it to anyone who would listen, calling it just as good as anything you'd see at a resort. But when the Johnsons unveiled their backyard oasis, her pool seemed less like a feature and more like a plastic toy. And Karen did not take humiliation well. At first, her obsession with the Johnsons' pool was subtle. She lingered a little too long when walking her dog, staring through the fence at the glittering water. She positioned herself on her second-story balcony with binoculars, claiming she was bird-watching, though her gaze often wandered to the Johnson property. And soon, she began spreading rumors at HOA meetings, suggesting that such a large pool surely violated community regulations. Of course, it didn't. Every permit was approved, every box checked, but Karen needed something, anything, to feel like she still had the upper hand. The Johnsons, meanwhile, went about their summer plans unaware of just how far Karen's fixation was growing. They had installed a state-of-the-art security system, complete with cameras covering every angle of the backyard. To them, it was a simple precaution. After all, break-ins weren't common in Willow Creek, but peace of mind was worth the investment. What they didn't realize at the time was just how critical that system would become. The first real incident happened on a Wednesday afternoon while the Johnson family was away visiting relatives. The sun was blistering, the air sticky with heat, and the neighborhood sat unusually quiet. That's when Karen decided to act. Dressed in oversized sunglasses, a floppy hat, and carrying a large tote bag, she strolled casually down the street. Anyone watching might have assumed she was simply out for a walk. But as soon as she reached the Johnsons' property, she scanned the street, checked for witnesses, and slipped through the side gate. The cameras caught everything. With no hesitation, Karen dropped her bag on the patio, peeled off her cover-up to reveal a bright floral swimsuit, and dove headfirst into the water. She didn't just dip her toes or wade in. She swam laps, floated on her back, and even helped herself to one of the lounge chairs. Hours passed as she sunned herself by the Johnsons' waterfall, sipping from a bottle she had smuggled in her tote. It might have been the perfect crime, if not for the blinking red light of the security camera mounted on the fence. Later that evening, as the Johnsons settled back at their relative's home, a notification pinged on their phones. The motion detection system had picked up unusual activity in the backyard. They opened the live feed and froze. There on their screen was Karen, laughing to herself, splashing in the pool and making herself at home in a space that wasn't hers. Shock turned to disbelief. Disbelief hardened into anger. This wasn't a friendly neighbor asking for permission. This was trespassing. This was violation. This was Karen Wellington, crossing a line she had no right to cross. The Johnsons watched in stunned silence as Karen spent nearly 3 hours luxuriating in their pool. She left only when the sun began to set, drying herself off with one of their towels and slipping out the gate as if nothing had happened. That night, the Johnsons couldn't sleep. The footage played over and over in their minds. What would have happened if they hadn't installed cameras? How many times had she done this before? And what would stop her from doing it again? By the time dawn broke, one thing was certain. Karen had made a mistake, a big one, and the Johnsons weren't going to let it slide. But instead of rushing into confrontation, they began to plan, quietly, methodically. Because if Karen thought she could use their pool without consequences, she was about to learn just how wrong she was. And this was only the beginning. The next morning, the Johnson family gathered around their kitchen island, bleary-eyed from lack of sleep but united in purpose. The footage of Karen floating in their pool still lingered on the television screen, paused at the moment she reclined smugly on their lounge chair. It wasn't just trespassing, it was entitlement. And entitlement, if left unchecked, had a way of growing like weeds. The Johnsons could have gone straight to the HOA with the evidence. They could have called the police, filed a complaint, and watched Karen squirm under the weight of legal consequences. But as they sipped their coffee and exchanged knowing glances, they agreed on one thing. That would be too easy. Karen thrived on drama. If she were confronted outright, she would twist the narrative, play the victim, and somehow convince the neighborhood that they were the unreasonable ones. No, this required something smarter, something colder. A kind of revenge that wouldn't just stop Karen from trespassing again, but one that would expose her behavior to everyone she so desperately tried to impress. The plan began with silence. Instead of reacting immediately, the Johnsons carried on as though nothing had happened. They waved at neighbors, tended their garden, and hosted weekend cookouts. Outwardly, life went on. But behind the scenes, every step was calculated. They upgraded their security system, installing hidden cameras with better angles. They purchased a small, waterproof camera disguised as a rock and placed it near the poolside chairs. And they adjusted the motion sensor notifications to ensure they would be alerted the very moment someone entered their backyard. The following week, the trap was set. It didn't take long for Karen to return. On another sweltering afternoon, and when the neighborhood seemed deserted, she repeated the same routine. Hat, tote bag, gate, only this time her behavior was even bolder. She lounged for hours, scrolling on her phone, dipping in and out of the water, and even blasting music from a portable speaker she had brought with her. The Johnsons, once again away for the weekend, watched the live feed with a mix of fury and fascination. Karen wasn't just trespassing. She was acting as though their pool belonged to her. The footage piled up. Each visit was documented in high definition, complete with timestamps and multiple camera angles. On one occasion, she even brought a friend, who looked nervous but followed her lead. Another time, she used their grill to cook a meal, leaving behind scraps and wrappers as though she owned the place. The Johnsons knew they could have stopped it right then. A single phone call, a police report, and Karen's little escapades would have ended. But patience was their weapon, and they wielded it carefully. Every trespass, every careless action, every ounce of arrogance was being collected like evidence in a courtroom. and when the time came, the entire neighborhood would see the truth laid bare. Meanwhile, Karen carried on with her usual theatrics at HOA meetings. She continued nitpicking others' yards, criticizing parked cars, and filing petty complaints. She even bragged about how busy she was with her so-called summer plans, never revealing where she was spending most of her afternoons. To her, the Johnsons' silence was a gift. She believed they were oblivious, that she had outsmarted them, and that her secret paradise would remain hers alone. But cracks were starting to form. Neighbors began whispering about Karen's sudden tan, about the faint smell of chlorine on her clothes, about the wet footprints spotted near her driveway on afternoons when no one else in her home seemed to be swimming. One particularly observant resident remarked how strange it was that Karen's above-ground pool never looked used, despite her constant boasting about it. Karen brushed it off with excuses, but the seeds of suspicion had been planted. The Johnsons nurtured those seeds carefully. They started leaving subtle hints in casual conversations with neighbors, offhand remarks about how grateful they were for their security cameras, comments about how quiet their backyard had been lately, even a chuckle about strange things happening when you least expect it. Nothing direct, nothing accusatory, just enough to stir curiosity. And then came the moment they had been waiting for. On the hottest Saturday of the summer, when temperatures climbed to unbearable heights, Karen made her boldest move yet. She arrived at the Johnson property in broad daylight, carrying an inflatable pool float shaped like a flamingo. She set it up, slid into the pool, and drifted lazily under the sun as though she were in her own private resort. The cameras caught every detail. By that evening, the Johnsons had compiled weeks of footage into a single, undeniable timeline. Clip after clip showed Karen trespassing, lounging, eating, and even inviting guests. It was more than enough to prove a pattern. It was a narrative, one that painted her exactly as she was, a woman who believed the rules didn't apply to her. The Johnsons didn't just want to confront her. They wanted the entire community to see. And so, they began planning the perfect stage for her downfall. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for the following week, and it would be hosted at the clubhouse, a gathering spot where dozens of residents would attend. Karen, as usual, was already preparing her stack of complaints to present. She thrived on these meetings, using them as opportunities to posture and control. But what she didn't know was that this particular meeting would mark the beginning of her unraveling. The Johnsons arranged their evidence neatly on a laptop, connected it to a projector, and prepared their opening remarks. They wouldn't accuse her with words. They would let the footage speak for itself. And as the day of the meeting approached, the Johnsons found themselves strangely calm. They had endured weeks of watching their neighbor invade their space. Now, the time for patience was ending. The storm they had quietly built was about to break, and when it did, Karen would find herself standing in the middle of it, exposed for all to see. The countdown to her humiliation had begun. The clubhouse buzzed with anticipation that evening. HOA meetings at Willow Creek Estates were never calm affairs. Neighbors bickered over paint colors, mailbox styles, and landscaping choices. Karen Wellington was usually at the center of it all, armed with binders of evidence and a voice that demanded attention. For her, the meetings were a stage, and the audience was the neighborhood she sought to dominate. But this night was different. The Johnsons arrived early, laptop in hand, their faces unreadable. They exchanged polite greetings, smiled at familiar faces, and quietly set up their equipment near the projector. Their demeanor was calm, deliberate. They weren't here to argue or defend themselves. They were here to reveal the truth. Karen, on the other hand, made her entrance with dramatic flair. She wore a crisp white blouse, her hair pinned perfectly, and carried a thick folder of complaints. She moved from group to group, whispering about a neighbor's overgrown hedge, about someone's garbage cans left out overnight, about how she had serious concerns regarding property values. To anyone listening, it was business as usual. What she didn't realize was that whispers about her had already begun to circulate. Neighbors had noticed inconsistencies, her sudden suntan, the faint smell of sunscreen that clung to her even during evening meetings, and her casual references to pool days when her above-ground pool sat untouched and murky. People were curious, but no one dared confront her directly. Not yet. When the meeting officially began, the HOA president rattled off the usual agenda items: budget reports, maintenance updates, upcoming community events. Karen shifted impatiently in her seat, eager for her turn to speak. She was already rehearsing her grievances in her head, ready to unleash a barrage of complaints about lawn heights and fence colors. But then the Johnsons raised their hand. They asked to present something before the open discussion began. Their tone was polite, almost casual, but their request carried a quiet authority that drew the room's attention. The president agreed, and the Johnsons stepped forward, connecting their laptop to the projector. The screen lit up. At first, the footage was silent, just an image of the Johnsons' pristine backyard. The pool shimmered under the summer sun, perfectly still. Then, movement. The side gate creaked open, and a familiar figure entered the frame. Gasps rippled through the room. There, larger than life on the clubhouse screen, was Karen Wellington, stepping confidently into the Johnsons' yard with her oversized hat and tote bag. The video continued to play, showing her stripping down to her swimsuit and sliding into the pool as though it were her own. The room fell into stunned silence, but the Johnsons weren't finished. Clip after clip rolled across the screen, Karen grilling burgers on their patio, lounging on their chairs, and even floating on the ridiculous flamingo pool float she had brought. The timestamps made it undeniable. This wasn't a one-time mistake. This was a pattern, a habit, a deliberate trespassing spree. Neighbors exchanged wide-eyed looks, some covering their mouths in disbelief, others whispering furiously to one another. For years, Karen had positioned herself as the neighborhood watchdog, the self-proclaimed enforcer of rules. And now, here she was, caught red-handed violating the very boundaries she claimed to protect. Karen's face drained of color. She shifted in her seat, clutched her folder tightly, and tried to compose herself. For a moment she opened her mouth as if to speak, but no words came. The footage was too clear, too damning. Her image, laughing, lounging, trespassing, filled every corner of the clubhouse. When the video ended, the Johnsons didn't gloat. They didn't raise their voices or accuse her directly. They simply stated, in measured tones, that their property had been violated, that their privacy had been disrespected, and that they had collected undeniable proof. They explained how they had remained silent, choosing instead to document everything to ensure fairness. And then, they left the evidence to speak for itself. The HOA president cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. For once, Karen wasn't the one controlling the conversation. She was the subject of it. Neighbors who had once feared her sharp tongue now muttered openly about consequences. Some demanded fines. Others whispered about police involvement. A few simply shook their heads in disbelief, realizing that the woman who had berated them for minor infractions was guilty of something far worse. Karen finally stood, her voice trembling as she attempted to spin the narrative. She claimed it was all a misunderstanding, that she had permission, that she thought the Johnsons wouldn't mind. But her excuses fell flat. The timestamps, the repeated visits, the sheer audacity of her actions, it was all undeniable. For the first time, Karen had no control. The HOA meeting that night was unlike any other. Instead of nitpicking trivial details, the community united in their outrage. The hypocrisy was too much to ignore. Karen, the self-appointed guardian of neighborhood rules, had been exposed as a trespasser, a liar, and a fraud. The Johnsons said little more. They didn't need to. Their quiet, methodical patience had done what arguments never could. They had let Karen condemn herself with her own actions. By the time the meeting adjourned, Karen had stormed out, red-faced and furious, clutching her folder like a lifeline. The whispers followed her out the door, spreading through the crowd like wildfire. Her reputation, once ironclad, was crumbling before her eyes. But for the Johnsons, this was only phase 1. Public humiliation was powerful, but it wasn't enough. Karen had trespassed not once, not twice, but repeatedly. She had invaded their privacy, disrespected their property, and acted as though consequences didn't exist. A public shaming at the HOA was satisfying, but it wasn't justice. Justice would come next. Because while the neighbors now knew the truth, Karen still hadn't learned her lesson. She still believed she could twist the story, reclaim control, and claw her way back into power. And the Johnsons? They weren't going to let her. The real revenge was only beginning. The fallout from the HOA meeting spread through Willow Creek Estates like wildfire. By the next morning, nearly every resident had heard the story. Some had been in the room to witness the footage firsthand, while others caught wind of it through whispered conversations and hurried texts. Either way, the narrative was the same. Karen Wellington had been caught trespassing in the Johnsons' pool, and she had been exposed in front of everyone. For years, Karen had built her identity around control. She wasn't just a neighbor. She was the self-proclaimed authority on community standards, the one who noticed every detail, the one who claimed to keep Willow Creek respectable. Her reputation was her armor. And now, in a single evening, that armor had cracked wide open. Karen's response was predictable. She retreated at first, hiding behind closed curtains and avoiding her usual morning walks. But isolation wasn't her nature. Within days, her desperation bubbled to the surface. She began crafting stories, telling anyone who would listen that the Johnsons had manipulated the footage, that the cameras had been edited, that the whole thing was a smear campaign to discredit her. But no one believed her. The footage had been too clear, too undeniable, and the neighbors she had once intimidated now felt emboldened. Old grievances resurfaced. Memories of her nitpicking, her threats of HOA fines, her constant meddling. People no longer saw her as a watchdog. They saw her as a hypocrite who had finally been unmasked. Karen's attempts to regain control grew more frantic. She staged dramatic phone calls on her porch, loudly insisting she was talking to lawyers. She dropped hints about suing the Johnsons for defamation. She even approached the HOA president directly, demanding he intervene on her behalf. But each effort failed. The evidence was too strong, and the president, tired of years of her disruptions, refused to side with her. Meanwhile, the Johnsons remained quiet. That silence gnawed at Karen more than anything else. If they had gloated, if they had mocked her publicly, she might have had something to fight against. But their restraint left her flailing, her anger ricocheting with no target. It was as though they had already won, and she couldn't stand the thought of it. But what Karen didn't realize was that the Johnsons weren't finished. Their patience, the same patience that had allowed them to document her trespassing, was still guiding them. They weren't just satisfied with her public humiliation. They wanted lasting consequences. The first step came quietly. The Johnsons filed an official police report, submitting the footage as evidence of trespassing. They didn't announce it. They didn't warn Karen. They simply let the wheels of justice begin to turn. And while the process was slow, the documentation was meticulous. Karen's repeated invasions of their property were undeniable. At the same time, the Johnsons took a more creative approach. They upgraded their security system yet again, this time with features designed not just to protect, but to deter. They installed motion-activated sprinklers near the pool, ones programmed to drench any uninvited guest who dared to enter. They added floodlights that triggered the moment the gate opened, and they placed subtle signs on their fence, not accusatory but pointed, reading, "Smile, you're on camera." Word spread quickly. Neighbors chuckled as they walked past, recognizing the quiet jab aimed squarely at Karen. And though no one mentioned her name directly, the implication hung heavy in the summer air. Karen's desperation deepened. She began hosting small gatherings at her own home, attempting to reclaim her image. She invited neighbors to swim in her aging above-ground pool, offering snacks and drinks as though nothing had happened. But the turnout was sparse. Those who did attend whispered about the murky water, the cracked plastic lining, the way Karen overcompensated with forced laughter. The contrast between her backyard and the Johnsons was glaring, and everyone noticed. One sweltering afternoon, unable to resist, Karen tested the waters again, literally. She crept toward the Johnsons' gate, convinced they had moved past the incident. Perhaps, she thought, she could slip in unnoticed, reclaim her secret paradise. But the moment she pushed the gate open, a blinding floodlight snapped on. Within seconds, the sprinklers erupted, drenching her from head to toe in icy water. The cameras caught everything. Karen staggered back, soaked and humiliated, scrambling to shut the gate as laughter echoed faintly from a nearby porch. A neighbor had witnessed the whole spectacle, and by the end of the evening, the story had already circulated through half the neighborhood. The once feared enforcer of rules was now the punchline of summer. But still, she didn't stop. Her pride wouldn't allow it. Instead, she doubled down. She wrote lengthy posts in the neighborhood online forum, accusing the Johnsons of harassment. She claimed the sprinklers were weapons, that the floodlights were designed to target her specifically. She insisted the Johnsons were bullying her. Yet each post was met with silence, or worse, thinly veiled sarcasm from neighbors who had grown tired of her antics. The more she fought, the more isolated she became. And through it all, the Johnsons remained quiet, calm, watching. Their revenge wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, it was steady, like ice spreading across glass. Karen's credibility crumbled piece by piece, her influence dissolving with every failed attempt to claw her way back. The community no longer feared her. They pitied her. They laughed at her. But the Johnsons still had one final card to play. The police report they had filed was working its way through the system, and soon Karen would be facing more than just embarrassment. She would be facing legal consequences. For Karen, the summer had begun with stolen swims in a paradise that wasn't hers. Now, it was unraveling into a nightmare of isolation, humiliation, and looming punishment. And as August heat pressed down on Willow Creek Estates, everyone sensed it. The drama wasn't over yet. The biggest storm was still on the horizon. By late August, the weight of summer hung heavy over Willow Creek Estates. The days were long, the air thick, and the neighborhood still buzzed with the fallout of Karen Wellington's humiliation. Her trespassing scandal had become the story of the season, whispered about at backyard barbecues and gossiped over during evening walks. But while the laughter and speculation of neighbors stung her pride, it was nothing compared to what came next. The Johnsons' patience had reached its final stage. Weeks earlier, they had filed their police report, quietly handing over the carefully cataloged evidence. Every clip had been labeled, time-stamped, and organized, leaving no room for doubt. It hadn't been a rash decision. It had been methodical, deliberate, and ironclad. Now, the consequences were finally catching up to Karen. It started with a knock on her door. Neighbors who happened to be outside described the moment vividly. A patrol car rolled slowly down the street and stopped in front of Karen's pristine white house. Two uniformed officers stepped out, walking up the path with the calm authority of people who knew exactly what they were about to do. Curtains twitched across the neighborhood as residents peeked out to watch. For years, Karen had positioned herself as the enforcer of rules. Now the enforcers had come for her. Karen answered the door with her usual sharpness, at first assuming the officers were there on her behalf. She had convinced herself that her complaints about the Johnsons' sprinklers and lights had finally reached the right ears. But as soon as the officers began to explain the purpose of their visit, her demeanor shifted. The color drained from her face, her confidence faltering. The charges were clear: repeated trespassing, documented by indisputable video evidence. The officers weren't there to debate or negotiate. They were there to inform her of the seriousness of her actions and to issue her a formal citation. The scene played out in front of the neighborhood. Karen's voice rose, shrill and defensive, carrying across the street as she tried to talk her way out of trouble. She pointed toward the Johnsons' home, accusing them of staging the whole thing, insisting it was a setup. But the officers remained calm, unflinching, repeating that the evidence was undeniable. By the time they left, Karen's carefully curated image had collapsed entirely. She slammed her door, retreating inside, but the damage was already done. The sight of law enforcement on her doorstep had been enough to seal her fate in the eyes of the neighborhood. The woman who once boasted about rules and regulations was now branded as the one who broke them. For the Johnsons, the moment brought a quiet satisfaction. They hadn't shouted. They hadn't gloated. They had simply allowed justice to arrive at Karen's doorstep, just as they knew it eventually would. And while the incident didn't land her in handcuffs, it left her with fines, legal fees, and a permanent mark on her record. But Karen wasn't ready to accept defeat. In the days that followed, she attempted one last campaign to salvage her reputation. She printed flyers claiming she was the victim of harassment, stuffing them into mailboxes throughout the neighborhood. She posted long rants in the community forum, accusing the Johnsons of orchestrating a vendetta against her. She even tried to sway sympathy by claiming the police involvement had been traumatizing. Yet each attempt only deepened her isolation. Neighbors who had once tolerated her antics now openly mocked her. Screenshots of her posts circulated with sarcastic commentary. Her flyers ended up in trash bins, some even taped back onto her own door as a cruel reminder of her downfall. The Johnsons, meanwhile, remained above it all. Their silence spoke louder than any argument. By refusing to engage with Karen's theatrics, they denied her the attention she craved. And in that silence, her influence withered away. But the Johnsons weren't done securing their peace. They knew that Karen's desperation made her unpredictable. A person who had trespassed so boldly, who had lied so easily, couldn't be trusted to change overnight. So they took one final step. They applied for a restraining order. The evidence they had collected, the videos, the timestamps, the police report, formed a case strong enough that the court granted it swiftly. Karen was now legally prohibited from approaching the Johnsons' property. If she so much as stepped near their gate again, the consequences would escalate far beyond fines. When word spread of the restraining order, the neighborhood's perception of Karen shifted from ridicule to caution. She was no longer just the meddlesome neighbor. She was someone with legal boundaries placed against her. For a community obsessed with reputation and appearances, the stigma was crushing. Karen's world shrank rapidly. Invitations to block parties stopped. Neighbors crossed the street to avoid her. Children whispered and giggled as they rode past her house. She had become a cautionary tale, a living reminder of what happened when arrogance collided with accountability. For the Johnsons, the shift was liberating. Their backyard, once a stage for Karen's trespassing, was theirs again. They swam under the summer sun without the nagging fear of intrusion. They hosted friends, laughter echoing across the stone patio, their guests marveling at the beauty of their pool. And all the while, the security cameras remained in place, silent sentinels that had already proven their worth. But Karen's story wasn't finished. Humiliation, fines, and restrictions had cornered her, but her pride refused to let her surrender gracefully. In the quiet of her home, behind shuttered blinds, she stewed in bitterness, replaying her grievances over and over. And in that bitterness, the seeds of something darker began to take root. Because for someone like Karen, defeat wasn't just a wound, it was an obsession. And though the Johnsons had already won in every visible way, they sensed it. This wasn't over. Not yet. The restraining order should have been the end of it. For most people, the weight of legal consequences, the humiliation of being exposed, and the loss of community respect would have been enough to force them into silence. But Karen Wellington was not most people. For weeks after the officers visited her home, she lived in the shadow of her disgrace. The once bustling figure who had roamed the neighborhood with a clipboard in hand now slipped in and out of her driveway quietly, avoiding eye contact with neighbors. Her flyers and online rants had failed. The HOA no longer entertained her complaints. The Johnsons ignored her completely. And yet inside her home, bitterness festered. Every time she caught sight of the Johnsons' pool from her upstairs window, the resentment boiled. To her, it wasn't just about a backyard oasis. It was about control, about pride, about the idea that she had been bested by people she considered beneath her. As August rolled into September, the heat lingered. One sweltering evening, with the sound of laughter drifting from the Johnsons' yard, Karen snapped. She told herself it would be her victory lap, a final act to reclaim the dignity she believed she had lost. She convinced herself that if she could just step into that water one last time, she would be taking back what had been stolen from her. It was delusion, pure and simple, but in her mind it made perfect sense. That night, long after the Johnsons had gone inside, Karen made her move. Dressed in dark clothes, she crept along the side street, her heart pounding with adrenaline. She slipped through the gate, just as she had done so many times before. But this time was different. The floodlights blazed to life instantly, bathing her in harsh white light. The motion-activated sprinklers erupted, drenching her in icy streams of water. The cameras blinked, recording every second of her intrusion. But Karen pressed forward, determined to reach the pool. She threw herself into the water with a defiant splash, thrashing against the icy shock of chlorinated waves. For a moment, she felt triumphant. She was back in the paradise she had once claimed, back in control. But her victory was short-lived. Within minutes, the Johnsons appeared on their back patio, drawn by the commotion. They didn't yell, they didn't threaten. They simply stood there, calm and steady, as Karen clung to the edge of the pool, shivering under the glare of the lights. Her defiance crumbled into panic when she heard the distant wail of sirens. The Johnsons had already called the police. By the time the officers arrived, Karen was soaked, trembling, and incoherent with rage. She screamed about conspiracies, about harassment, about how she was the victim. But the evidence told a different story. The cameras had captured everything, from the moment she slipped through the gate to the desperate splash in the water. This time there was no citation, no slap on the wrist. The officers placed her in handcuffs and led her to the patrol car as the neighborhood watched from behind curtains and porch railings. The woman who had once strutted through HOA meetings with authority was now reduced to a drenched spectacle, her downfall complete. The silence that followed was profound. The Johnsons didn't celebrate. They didn't boast. They simply locked their gate, turned off the floodlights, and went back inside. Their point had been made, and their patience had carried them to the end. In the weeks that followed, Karen's presence in Willow Creek Estates all but vanished. Rumors swirled that she was facing more than just fines, that legal battles and court appearances were consuming her life. Her house grew quiet, her yard unkempt, her once perfect facade crumbling like the reputation she had destroyed with her own hands. The Johnsons, on the other hand, thrived. Their pool once again became a place of joy and peace. Friends gathered, children played, and the sound of laughter returned without the shadow of intrusion. The security cameras remained, silent reminders of the battle they had endured, but they no longer felt like necessities. They felt like trophies. Neighbors who had once feared Karen now gravitated toward the Johnsons, offering friendly waves and casual conversations. The community had shifted, its balance restored. The reign of Karen Wellington had ended, and in its place was a quieter, kinder neighborhood where people no longer felt watched or judged. But the story of Karen became legend. New residents heard it in hushed tones, told as a cautionary tale at summer cookouts. Children giggled about the pool thief whenever they rode their bikes past her house, and every time someone mentioned her name, it was accompanied by a knowing shake of the head. For the Johnsons, the saga had been exhausting, but it had also proven something important. Patience was the ultimate weapon. By letting Karen expose herself, by resisting the urge to lash out too quickly, they had turned the tables in a way no confrontation ever could. Their revenge had been cold, calculated, and unforgettable. And so, the summer ended not with Karen basking in stolen waters, but with her drowning in the consequences of her own arrogance. The pool shimmered under the September sun, untouched by trespassers, a symbol of peace restored. And the Johnsons, finally free from the shadow of their meddlesome neighbor, leaned back in their chairs and smiled, knowing that Karen's biggest mistake had been underestimating them. In Willow Creek Estates, the story was settled. Karen had trespassed into the wrong pool, and it had cost her everything.